So it's going to be a complete deadlift breakdown. We're going to go over setup, technique, and variations. Let's jump in on this. So from here with the traditional bar setup, if we go down to the ground, our plates are about 18 inches high. These are about pretty standard when it comes to bumper plates. So that puts the bar at around 9 inches tall. So if I'm 6 foot, pretty good mobility, this could be a pretty good solid setup. But if I have a taller athlete, a taller individual, maybe they have hip or back restrictions, I want to elevate these plates up off the ground to put me in a better position to pull from, because a deadlift itself is a great exercise, but depending upon your anthropometrics, it might not be the best fit for you. So we have to make this exercise fit to you, not cram you into an exercise. From there, if I'm going to pull this deadlift from the floor, I even need to change the vernacular that I choose, because I think far too often than not, when we think about a deadlift, we program it and prioritize it as a pulling exercise, because I am technically pulling it away from the floor, but I do think it changes how we approach this movement if we look at it more as a push. By prioritizing a deadlift as a pushing movement, I think we get more out of it, because now we're coaching rigidity, coaching stability, and now I'm really pushing into the floor for that full expression of power and strength going vertical. So for the setup, I'm going to go feet about shoulder width apart. For me, that's going to place my shins somewhere around the edges of the knurl with the bar that we have. From here, I'm going to think about bringing my shins as close to this bar as possible. I'm hugging it, trying to close this line. We don't want to deadlift with the bar far away from our body. Now that pivot point that's occurring with the hips, now we're getting away from it. We're loading the lower back. We want as much of this weight onto our body as possible. From here, I'm going to start with my shins close to the bar. I'm going to break at the hips, sliding back, feeling the tension in my hamstrings, and then from there, kind of descending down. That's when I'll get a little bit of a break in the knee, break in the hips, descend down. I might get a little bit of knee moving forward. From here, I'm going to go with an overhand grip. When I grab the bar, I want you to think about a towing. If I was a truck pulling a trailer and I had a chain, I would want to get all the slack out of the chain before I hit the gas. When people grab the bar, sometimes you'll see them have a loose hand grip, and they'll yank and they'll pull the bar. That puts a lot of stress not only on the biceps, but the shoulder, and we lose that rigidity that we have. So I want to make sure that I get as rigid as possible, grab full hand grip of the bar, and now I'm going to push away. Slide back in the hamstrings, descend down to the ground. That huge cue that I said there as a push is what I think changes the exercise completely, because now I'm thinking about a vertical expression, pushing through the floor, driving my hips. And now we really start to get into that concept of jumping, sprinting, loading back, driving the hips forward, rather than pulling and making a circular pattern, loading the lower back. When it comes to the tactical population, I have so many guys that have forward head posture, heads going forward, big rounding of the spine. I don't want to compound that with a circular movement that we're really loading pretty heavy on our posture. To get a little bit more detailed on the setup, I want you to think about looking at the ground about 8 feet in front of us. For me, that's a good gaze that we can keep our eyes on that kind of puts our head in the right position. I've seen some coaches that like to coach down, and then they'll coach eyes up on the horizon. I think sometimes when we move our eyes, we move our head, we move our spine, and then we start to get into this front to back position. I want you to keep your eyes 8 feet in front of you, staring at a spot the entire time. So I'm going to get up in this nice setup, about 8 feet in front of me, nice and tight, get the slack out of the bar, push through the floor, my eyes stay there. Slide back into the hinge, eyes stay there, back down. I know you can't really hear it on the other side of this video, but when I grab the bar and I pull the slack out, we have a really good Olympic bar and plate setup, but I can still feel the bar get to the top of the plates, and that's letting me know I have all the slack out of it. I get that nice pull, slack gets out of the bar, it gets to the top of the plates, and that's my go button. I know I have all the tension out of the bar, and I'm pushing. This is a lightweight as seen here, but as I progressively get heavier, I want to make sure I treat my lightest like my heaviest, so when I get to my heaviest, I've been there. When it comes to creating tension from the bottom of this deadlift, I've heard the cue of crushing an orange in your armpit. Basically, I'm just trying to create as much torque as possible. No different than a bench press where I'm trying to create torque in my arms to drive that power. I'm thinking the same thing about creating rigidity with this barbell. So as I grab this overhand position, My elbows are kind of out. I like to kind of get out of position so that I can get into position. So I'm kind of out of position seen here, bars on my shins, and I'm going to crush those oranges. I'm thinking shoulder blades down and back, getting as retracted and rigid as possible. I don't want any movement with this exercise. This is a bilateral pushing through the floor vertical expression of strength and power. So anything that takes away from that is going to take away from the purpose of this movement. As rigid as possible from the hinge, crushing the oranges, eyes about 8 feet in front of me on the ground, rigid torso, chin down, drive through the floor, drive to the bar. Very important when it comes to the deadlift is to talk about our core and our position. I want us to think about our ribs. So I'll give the cue commonly about finding 10 and 10. So my thumbs, if you put your thumbs on the bottom of your ribs and the pinkies on the top of your pelvis, I want you to think about this as an imaginary 10 inches. And then I want you to think about it being the same 10 inches on the backside. When I look at my core, when I look at my pillar, if I rise my front side and I have 12 inches, that other 10 inches on the back has to get reduced. No different than a spring. As one gets wider, one has to get shorter. So if I'm thinking about being in control of my posture and control of my pillar, I need to be in active flexion. So I'm actively aware of what's going on with the front side of my body. So from there, when I'm sliding back into the hinge, I'm not thinking about arching my back as I slide back. I'm thinking about locking this down, abs nice and tight, sliding back into the hinge, eyes 8 feet in front of me. So now I'm very rigid. I'm locked into this hinge. So then when I push through the floor, that stays the same. I want you to think about bringing your hips to the bar and not bringing the bar to your hips. The bar should travel almost in a straight line directly up, and we're moving our body around the bar to bring that bar straight up with a good bar path. So let's bring this all together. My feet are about shoulder width apart. I'm going to slide back into the hinge, active flexion, abs are tight. From there, I'm going to descend down to the bar. I'm going to grab it with an overhand grip. I'm going to get a good full grip on my hands, getting the bar deep in my hands. I'm going to crush those oranges, creating rigidity, shoulder blades down and back, eyes 8 feet in front of me, push through the floor, bring my hips to the bar, squeeze my glutes. That ends the lift. I'm squeezing my glutes, and then from here, I'm letting off my glutes. Abs are still tight, sliding down my thigh, descending down to the ground. Bar returns to its original position. For me, that's a solid setup that we can compound with weight, with velocity, and we can really turn this exercise into a great movement and pattern that we can load. From the ground, we want as minimal of a shoe as possible, and we definitely want a flat surface. I want to match the rigidity of the ground because I'm trying to put as much force into the ground as possible. If I was doing a vertical jump test, I wouldn't have you jump on the grass. I would have you jump on something hard like matting or a basketball court, something that when you put force into the ground, it's not dissipating away, it's sending that force right back up through your foot. So I like a barefoot shoe because it lets my foot splay and also gives me that good connection. But if you want to go with a barefoot with socks or even some sort of flat shoe, that's okay as well. When it comes to cueing the foot, I'm thinking about big toes down, good separation of my toes, trying to create as much torque in the ground as possible. Some people will say create a pickle jar effect. Some people will say just driving our big toe to the ground. Whatever you like, as long as you're getting that good connection to the ground, sending that force up through your hip. So now some variations we can use to make this exercise personal to not only our body, but to our goals. For starters, a quick adjustment that we can make is elevating the plates up off the ground. So if I have an athlete that's a little bit taller, or maybe even an athlete that has some back issues, I can elevate these plates by using another set of plates. Some people have boxes, some fancier items, but we could just use something as simple as another plate. From there, I'm going to elevate this bar up off the ground. And depending upon your body type, by elevating the plates and increasing that 9-inch height that I previously talked about, it may put you in a better position to push through the floor from. A little bit more advantageous if your hips, we don't have to go as far down. Your back isn't in a compromised position, but it still allows us to load the hinge through this bilateral pattern. Everything's the same setup. Bar's a little bit higher on my shin. Eyes still 8 feet in front of us. Get the slack out of the bar. Toes down. Push through the floor. Bring your hips forward. Slide back, descend down, everything's the same. Simple layers that we can add when it comes to a deadlift is the intent that we choose. So a normal intentful deadlift, kind of pulling that high strength component of nice and rigid, getting as tight as possible, good ascent, slow descent, toes down, that's pretty traditional. I can change this and add a layer of more of a velocity implement by getting nice and tight, exploding up, descending down with control, eccentric load. I can play with tempos. I can even add a band wrapped around the bar to kind of play with that accommodated resistance profile with the bar. That can be something as simple as wrapping the bar here, stepping in. So now I'm going to get more of an accommodated resistance effect. So the bar is going to be heavier at the top end of my lift. So whether it comes to hip extension or whatnot, more of an athletic profile of using a deadlift, this would be a great alternative and variation that you can simply add in. But once again, it's still just a deadlift. Band's nice and tight. Stand on it. Try to find a good foot position even though we're standing on a band. Overhand head position. Everything's locked in still. Nice and tight. Stand up through. Nice and tight. Get rigid. Push. Control back down. I can even take that same pattern and change it another slight layer by opening up my feet a little bit wider. So now I'm getting a little bit more adductors, more stress on the hamstrings from a different pulling position. From here, I'm going to still take that same overhand grip, descending down, picking it up right inside the knees. Eyes in the same position. Our setup is all the same. Toes down. Nice and tight and rigid. Push. Drive my hips. Descend down. Get nice and tight, rigid. Push. Control down. One of my biggest pet peeves when it comes to the deadlift is when people turn their hand over. I do understand it helps you lift a higher weight, but I think far too often than not, people rely on that at the last minute. So they'll do all their working sets with the hands over position, and then when they get to that position, they need to turn their hand over. That's a lot of stress on the bicep that they haven't prepared that tissue for. And obviously, when we think about the bicep and how we get into those positions, we're getting into this loaded position. By nature of us having our hand turned, I'm already kind of putting a twist in my body now. So when I talk about our posture and our pillar and how important it is to vertically express that power straight up to the ceiling, if I'm adding a twist in my body to lift more weight, I would rather you go both hands over and even go with wrist straps. So now that's going to allow you to load your posterior chain a little bit more where your grip doesn't fail you until you can train your grip to catch up with where you're at. Even the concept of having my hands turned over here, I feel my body weight shifting to my right leg. I feel my torso turning slightly, and I'm trying to balance that. And this is just with 135 on the bar. When I get up into the 400s or 500s, that twist definitely occurs, and there's a lot more stress on this bicep that I would never load with a bicep curl. So that's the deadlift. Setup, technique, and some variations. I think this is a great exercise that honestly gets blasted unfairly as being a bad movement for some people when it comes to their back, but it is a great exercise that we can progress or regress depending upon where you're at and your body type. Just make sure we're not trying to make your body fit to an exercise, but we're making this movement pattern, this exercise as a deadlift as it is, fits where your body is at currently.